please tell us what happens once you had approved the composition of the board?
Chair?
I'm sorry, can we go back to the question you had asked earlier on so that I can just make sure I understood the answer? The role of the president in the appointment of the board and the boards and maybe CEO of an SOE is the position that he has no role at all in terms of the law as you understood it after those legal opinions?
My understanding in the founding legislation of the various institutions over which I had oversight, that there is no envisaged role for the president. The president chairs cabinet, and I would imagine that if the president has concerns about a particular candidate or whatever, it would be at that cabinet meeting that those concerns would be raised. But I have not been able to find an instance in law or elsewhere, and yourselves as a commission might assist me here, where the president has the executive authority to instruct a minister to do this or that, to appoint this particular person or not appoint that person.
And the cabinet itself, was your understanding that it also didn't have a role unless that role was captured in a policy?
Let me explain that. Okay. So I'll just go back just 2 steps to explain that. Once I'm satisfied as a minister about the composition of a board, then a cabinet memorandum is prepared, which I sign off on, but it doesn't go directly to cabinet. It goes to a subcommittee of cabinet. And in this instance, it would be the economics subcommittee, because my ministers who are involved in the economy would have an interest in who I was proposing, and they would be able to comment. And this happens with every minister. Any memorandum, a decision memorandum, goes through a cabinet subcommittee. So cabinet meets 1 week, the following week a subcommittee, the next week cabinet. Okay. So the agenda of a cabinet is determined by the decisions that arise out of that cabinet subcommittee. And that subcommittee then is the committee that makes the recommendation to cabinet itself on the basis of the memorandum that a minister would have prepared. So in those circumstances, the agenda is managed by the Cabinet Secretariat, who receive all of these memos, these decision memos from ministers. It goes on to the particular subcommittee, and then it becomes part, if they approve of it, it becomes part. Now, when it goes to Cabinet, Cabinet is allowed to discuss the merits or demerits of that. But it's not usual that it would be dismissed like that.
Sending the memo that you are talking about to the subcommittee, would that, as you understood the position, have been a requirement of law, or would that have been based on the booklet that you said was issued in 2008, would that be based on practices that had been evolved over time?
Yes, Chair. The handbook for the appointment of persons to boards of state and state-controlled institutions says fairly specifically that you can't send every appointment to Cabinet. It says on page 22 of that handbook, and I think it's page 475 of your documentation, paragraph 15, it says it has become common practice for all appointments of persons to boards, to refer all appointments of persons to boards to the Cabinet. This places an unnecessary administrative burden on the Cabinet, particularly in those cases where legislation specifically provides that the responsible executive authority may appoint board members. Elsewhere, and I won't go into that, it does say, however, that if the board is significant, then it ought to go to Cabinet for approval, and then it also defines what is significant. And one of the definitions is if that particular institution has an asset base exceeding 1 billion. So my understanding in that regard is that it would go to Cabinet, ESCOM, Denel, all of those. However, the big issue which is not clarified in the handbook and was never clarified in my day is does it go to Cabinet for approval, for noting? What is the point? And the Department of Public Enterprises, when this became an issue, conducted an assessment of the extent of the Cabinet's involvement in order to establish a trend. And the review was from April 2002 to February 2009, relating to the appointment of CEOs, not boards, to a variety of SOEs. The results showed that Cabinet's involvement varied between approval, that was 10 times, concurrence, 6 times, and noting, twice, of the minister's decision, indicating that every CEO appointment is dealt with on a case-by-case basis, having considered the size, importance, and circumstances facing the SOE at that time. Now, I did consult with 1 or 2 Cabinet colleagues and people who worked with the Cabinet Secretariat on this matter around would the President be in a position to stop a process and whatever. I was informed by a previous Cabinet Minister that in his experience of President Mandela and Mbeki, if a Cabinet memo was patently incompetent, if it was a badly drawn up memo, the President would request that, or the Cabinet would request that the Minister go back and discuss it, and bring in. But it wasn't, both who I consulted said it was never a precedent, but the President must approve everything.
Thank you. Mr. Mkwana.
Mr. Chair, following on your questions, just to clarify the issues. Ms. Hogan, may I refer you to page 89? You will see that initially in my question when I ask you about who appoints the CEO or the board, and that would be regulated from time to time by the specific founding documents of that company. Do you agree?
Yes.
Now, let's take, for instance, Transnet in order to ventilate the issues which the chair was conversing with you. If you look at paragraph 12, it says that in terms of section 2, in brackets 1 and 3, read with section 4.1, Transnet is a public company. The state is its only shareholder, and the minister exercises the rights of the state as a shareholder on its behalf. Is this your understanding when you dealt with the issues pertaining to Transnet?
Correct.
Yes. Now, it also proceeds at paragraph 13 to say that the state's right as a shareholder exercised on its behalf by the minister include the following, and those are tabulated in terms of the
Correct.
opinion and with reference to particular sections of the Companies Act linked with the Transnet documents. Am I correct?
Correct.
Now, would you get the same sense also in ESCOM? One will have to go to the founding documents and to see how do they regulate those specific powers vis-a-vis the shareholder, the president, the board, and the CEO. Am I correct?
Correct.
Yes. Now, let's take the following example. In instances where you, as the minister, had went through a lawful process of appointing the board and having interacted with the relevant structures, can a president unilaterally rescind that decision of the board?
Rescind of a decision of a board appointing a CEO.
Sorry, the decision of you as the minister to appoint the board. Let's start by the board first. We'll then move on to the CEO. Where you have gone through the process of identifying individuals, their expertise, they're being interviewed, you have consulted with the relevant structures, can thereafter the president unilaterally outside cabinet simply rescind that decision of the appointment of the board?
Based on the opinions that I received, I would say that it would be extremely incorrect or irregular for the president to intervene and stop a process outside of a cabinet process.
Let's take the CEO, whereby the board, which is having the powers in terms of the relevant founding documents of Transnet or ESCOM, having identified the candidate, having engaged the experts, having recommended or found a suitable candidate. Can that be ignored by the simple say-so of the president, simply saying that that is not the candidate that I want?
In my understanding, not.
Yes. Mr. Chair, we'll at an appropriate time, we'll make submissions with reference to the relevant documents, but also bringing the evidence of this witness to fall in within that regulatory framework. We understand that she cannot comment on the legalities, but we wanted to give the factual spectrum on the issues that confronted her at the time.
No, that is in order.
Yes.
I don't know whether you are still going to deal with the issue of the different roles of different office bearers, or whether you are done speaking in general.
When we deal with the specific entities like ESCOM and Transnet, she will ventilate on those issues, Mr. Chair.
Okay, no, that's fine. Let me ask this question. The cabinet is a collective. It is appointed by the president. The ministers are appointed by the president. And as any minister is supposed to execute his or her functions in her or his portfolio in accordance with the Constitution, the law, the policies of government and the particular department, and whatever else it is that the government of which she is part seeks to achieve for the country. Now, I can imagine that where, for example, in terms of policies, in terms of even legislation, maybe as a minister you are required or you have a discretion to approach cabinet and hear what they may have to say about certain candidates that you are thinking of approving or appointing or supporting in terms of a board. I can imagine that you might not necessarily always want to stick to, you might not want to be rigid to say, for example, this can only be discussed at cabinet. You might want to say, before I go to cabinet, let me find out what the president's views are on this matter, because you might want to have an idea whether by the time you go to cabinet, you have the support of the president on the particular candidate, and if the president has got some issues, you might want to apply your mind to those issues before the matter goes to cabinet. Is that right?
Correct.
Yes. So does that not mean that maybe problem areas arise when maybe the different office bearers, let us say, well, one such office bearer is the president. The minister is another office bearer, and there are others. You might have a situation where, rightly or wrongly, the president might think the minister is not understanding her role properly, saying, well, I appointed her. The minister might be saying, well, the president is now overstepping, But where, for example, the president understands that you have in law the final say, and whatever views they express with an appreciation of that. There shouldn't be serious problems. Should there be, where when they express their views? What's your view? In other words, is the position not that it's not who you consult, it's how they perceive their role to be. If, for example, a president perceives that if he or she says no, even though the executive, the power in law rests with you, then no matter what the circumstances are, you should not pursue what you believe is right. Then there's a problem. But if the president says, look, I wouldn't support this candidate for this and that reason, but it's your decision. Take into account everything you're supposed to take into account, and then you have heard my views, but then make up your mind. Then there shouldn't be problems if that's the approach, isn't it?
I think you're absolutely correct, Chair. No minister would make an appointment to as crucial an institution without talking through the matter with people who do matter, who will have to back up those institutions at a certain stage. Consultation is different from interfering with what a minister does. My experience was that the president stopped things from going to cabinet, instructed me to withdraw things. And I will go more into the details, but what was very worrying about that was that in one of those instructions related to Transnet, there was a potential breach of law. So, you know, you do consult, you know. The president would phone you and say, listen, I hear this, can we talk a bit? But it's in a collegial basis. The same as you expect with your fellow cabinet ministers. They're not going to be driving their own agendas for their own purposes. But remember that the Executive Ethics Act says that you may not make a decision in exercising your powers as an executive authority if it is to benefit someone close to you or along those lines. So there is a constraint. A minister or president can't be doing this if it is to benefit some unknown persons.
No, thank you very, very much.
Thank
I
you.
thought at a general level it was important just us to understand what your views are in regard to that, because
Yes.
it may be that the problem might not really be consultation. The problem might be how consultation is understood and how everyone understands their role. Thank you very much. Mr. Mkwena.
Ms. Hogan, if I understood your interaction with the chair, you emphasize on a distinction between a consultation and an interference. And those interferences, we'll deal with them in due course when you talk to specifics. For now, just to complete the picture, can you explain to the chair what happens once you had approved the composition of the board and in relation to the cabinet, so that we get a full picture of your evidence?
Once the board is approved, you're saying what is the process, or before?
Yes, once you had approved as the
Once
minister.
I approve, then it goes to a subcommittee of cabinet. And that goes through the cabinet secretary. You know, the cabinet has a secretariat, and they run all the processes. So that, I have to sign off on it, and then that would go to the cabinet subcommittee. Sometimes the secretariat would say, oh, you haven't added this in, and, you know, there's a certain protocol about what must go into a memorandum. Then your fellow ministers will discuss it, and then it will go to cabinet. Your decision will go to cabinet. The decision of that subcommittee goes to cabinet. As a recommendation to cabinet, cabinet can further engage. The president chairs that committee, and that is the process that takes place. And then it's announced the next day.
Yes, and whatever that the president does will have to be within those structures that you have actually testified upon, that cabinet committee and those other processes.
Those are the processes that are understood, and once you become a minister, you are given a handbook which explains the cabinet decision-making process.
Yes.
And it's very carefully run. In each department, there is one person who's responsible only for cabinet documentation. That person links into the cabinet secretariat. There is a very sophisticated filing system. The minutes of those cabinet meetings are taken very seriously. If you have to do something in terms of a decision of cabinet, the secretariat will remind you. So those documents, and as you know, they are state secret, those documents and that process is the ultimate decision-making process of a government,
Yes.
of an executive authority.
Well, let me just ask this question, because I think it probably belongs at this stage when we are just talking in general. We've looked at the role of a minister and the president and the cabinet. Is there a legitimate role for the ruling party in the appointments of CEOs and boards of SOEs? Obviously, I asked this question because I've read your statement.
Yes, yeah. Well, that is what
In
I
other
would-
words,
yeah.
I'm saying, you have told us your understanding about what role the president has. On your understanding, he can't instruct you to say you may or may not appoint so and so. And you have said, as a minister, you won't just go and just appoint whoever you want. You would want to hear what your fellow cabinet members have to say, but you will appreciate that in the end, I think, if the power is given to you, it's the power you must exercise. Now, is there any legitimate role for the ruling party to make any input to a minister who is a member of the ruling party when she has to consider whether a particular CEO must be appointed, whether certain people must be put on the boards, or is there none?
Chair, in law, obviously it doesn't exist, the ruling party. There's nothing in law that requires a minister to consult with the ruling party. The problems that I think many of us may have experienced with the ruling party was that in 1994, when we came to government, the ANC set up a deployment committee. Now, at that time, the entire civil service was occupied by people from the apartheid era. There needed to be transformation, there needed to be transition. At the same time, there were large numbers of people who'd been in the struggle or had been sympathetic or who were wanting to use their professional skills for New South Africa. And how were they now going to be deployed? And in that sense, the ANC set up a deployment committee, which would say, you, Mr. Gordan, you will, no, they didn't say that to him, but it would be preferable if you went,
You want
let
to
me
say
not interfere with the minister.
You're Mr. X or Miss X.
Mr. X, Mrs. X. We'd want you to go, like they said to my partner, Mr. Kathrada, we would like you to be the parliamentary advisor to the president, to President Mandela. And so it was a question when you had to look at the resources available to you, the capable people, the people who understood what a new South Africa actually meant to be deployed. And it had to be on a massive basis. And those are the issues that come up with any change, fundamental change in government. My own view after an experience nowadays is that I sincerely wonder if a deployment committee plays a useful role now. It's a handful of people. If you see the number of appointments that go to cabinet every time, it's huge numbers of people. You don't know how many institutions government has got. And for a handful of people just simply to decide that this is their preferred candidate, on what basis, what transparency is there? I'm not saying that deployment committee didn't always operate with honesty and integrity, but the weakness of the system is that if that deployment committee is captured by whatever forces, it can have a fundamental impact on government. And so we do have to protect government from undue influence. Now that again doesn't mean, and I did it myself, I spoke to the Secretary General. We had differences of views on some matters and we agreed on other matters, on other appointments. He never wanted to know the full board or it was on sensitive matters. Often those sensitive matters were related to issues of transformation. But the president, I would consult. But I was very clear that I was hearing, because I needed to hear what the issues were, and on the basis of hearing everything, then I would apply my mind. But it became apparent during my time, and we will see it later in a press statement issued by the ANC or statements to the press, that even the NWC, the National Working Committee, which is the executive committee of the ANC, saw it as their right to instruct a minister who should be appointed and not appointed. That is an abuse of power, and that is usurping executive authority. Why have a minister if you're going to instruct that minister about what happens? I feel the same way very strongly about Parliament. When you become an MP, your responsibility is to the Constitution. You take into consideration, of course, ruling party views, but to be instructed by a ruling party about what you should do is usurping the legislative authority of, finally MPs must make a decision. But yes, robust engagement, yes, discussion, yes, persuasion. You don't want anyone appointed who's going to be knifed in the back by some political formations, but it cannot be instructions.
And you may or may not be able to answer this one, and feel free to say so if you are unable to. Do you know whether there is clarity within the ruling party as to where their role starts and where it stops in regard to, for example, the appointments of SOEs, boards and CEOs, and I know you have raised the question of Parliament. It's a very important question as to what a party can say to members of Parliament who are there on its ticket, as it is said, and that issue may become quite a big issue in regard to the work of this commission, because one of the things that we have to look into is what environment existed that may or may not have provided fertile ground for state capture.
Yeah.
Is there anything in our legislation? Is there anything in our electoral system? Is there anything in our laws that may have made it easy for certain things to happen which should not have happened? So, but we will deal with those, and I hope that people, political parties, government, and everybody can start thinking about that very wide and important issue. But for now, my question is simply whether you know whether there is clarity in the ruling party about where their role starts and where it ends in regard to the appointment of boards of SOEs, CEOs of SOEs, and so in other words, maybe their views can be sought, but it's just views and nothing more, or whether they can insist on certain appointments.
Chair, I can only speak to my experience at the time. There was no clarity on this. Even when there were talks of a deployment committee, I would ask, now, who's on this deployment committee and who's doing what? And I would be told, well, it's really not functional. So, that leaves you very confused about what is happening. But my first experience of this My first negative experience of the relationship between the party and the state emerged very early on in my career as a minister. As you will know, the ruling party, on the question of state-owned enterprises, had vetoed any privatization, and that was the position of the tripartite alliance, and had accepted, though, that there needed to be restructuring, and that was left very open-ended. You will recall that I came into that position as from the Minister of Health into public enterprises. In health, I had to deal with the Free State government running out of antiretrovirals in August. Government didn't have money. I had to go and speak to the American and British governments to make grants. Now that is how desperate funding is for people on the ground. So when I came to the portfolio and I had a look at it, one of the first things I noticed was how financially stressed, apart from Transnet, many of these SOEs were under control. And SAA was in 2 days of my appointment, I was already harassing the Minister of Finance to give them a guarantee, to keep them a going concern. And so I was really concerned about it. And I was interviewed by a reporter, and I said, you know, there will have to be an equity partner somewhere in this game. And I was saying that not in defiance. I was saying it because the reality was government did not have the resources to fund the deficit. We were also, it was shortly after the 2008 financial crisis. So the revenue that we were going to expect was terrible. That was reported. The Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General kicked up a huge fuss in the media and publicly summons me to explain myself at Luthuli House. Myself and the Deputy Minister, we both went and we explained, you know, at that meeting, I explained that SAA was in severe problems. And it was not easy to see a funding model. And I said, trust me, you are going to have real problems there. And they would not release a statement after that meeting. But my concern at that stage was if I was seen to be going outside of government policy, it should have been the president who summoned me, not the party. And so I'm not saying that I was saying the right thing or the incorrect thing, but it is the president, not the party. And what made things even more vulnerable at that time was that a certain faction, and I hate using these words, but a certain faction who was supporting the president who came in, President Zuma, was very powerful in that NEC at that stage. If you look at the National Working Committee at that stage, it consists almost entirely of his very vocal supporters. So there's a weakness there. You know, they were driving a whole agenda, and they saw themselves as super powerful, and they could now dictate, the Tripartite Alliance could dictate to the government what it should be doing, down to the level of who should be a CEO or not. And I think there are real problems there.
Thank you very much. And again, part of the context for this is that as we investigate these allegations of state capture and so on, at a certain stage, I'll have to make findings and reach conclusions. And one of the things we have to look at is where did things go wrong? And if things that go wrong include the role of a ruling party, we need to deal with there to say this may or may not have contributed to facilitating certain things happening, and what needs to be done in the future. What should future ruling parties not do if we are to avoid a repeat of things such as those that we are looking at? So that's the context.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mkwena.
Ms. Hogan, the issues arising from the chair's questions, would I be correct that they are dealt in your witness statement with reference to paragraphs 22 to 27? That's where you are talking about a parallel behind the scene processes. And you are also talking about the deployment committee of the ANC. Now, if I have understood the debate between yourself and the chair correctly, what you are saying is not necessarily that you are not
more a conversation than a debate.
A conversation with the chairperson.
We didn't have any debate.
There's a thin line, Mr. Chair. The conversation with the chairperson, you don't take issue with the question of having to consult the ruling party, but I think what we describe as the weakness is the lack of transparency, or where there could be inherent conflict.
Yes.
And that would result in people who are conflicted being appointed regardless of the proper lawful process that you had actually undertaken. Am I correct?
Correct.
Yes. Now, you in fact summarize that conversation with the chair. It's captured in paragraph 21. If you can go there of your statement, and if you can read paragraph 21, and also for completeness, read paragraph 25 and 26, so that at least we get a proper picture of what you wanted to convey to the chairperson about the parallel behind the scene processes on page 6 of your witness statement, paragraph 21.
Okay. I've read parts of the paragraph 21 that said the protocol, the assessment of how many it came, of how many appointments were approved, concurred, noted.
Exactly.
That, and then page 20.
Page 7.
Page 7, then it's.
Paragraph 25 and 26. If you can read that so that we can be able to understand better what you're conveying to the chair.
Yes, I was appointed a minister shortly after the Polokwane conference. And that conference was noted for the emergence of very strong factional tendencies within the ANC. So I say from paragraph 25, regrettably, these factional battles in the ANC only serve to encourage and entrench nepotism and patronage from within the ranks of the ANC in the tripartite alliance, and this would have very damaging consequences for state-owned enterprises and by extension for our economy, which I will illustrate below. With regard to my experience in the appointment of board members and CEOs of Transnet and Eskom during my time, it is important to note that there were 3 damaging processes afoot in my time with regard to SOE-related appointments. There were the very political and public maneuverings of certain elements within the ANC and the tripartite alliance to get their way. Then there were ways that President Zuma and some cabinet colleagues thwarted my attempts to get cabinet approval for board appointments, and I stress the word thwarted. And finally, the inexcusable interference was my responsibilities as a minister by President Zuma that eroded my executive authority, and I refer in particular to ESCOM in that regard.
And that's what you were conveying to the chair, isn't it?
The last paragraph, 27.
No, I'm saying that paragraph 25
Yes.
and 26,
Yes,
those
yeah.
are the essence of what you're conveying to the chairperson during
Yes.
your conversation. Yes.
Yes, Chair.
Now, I need to move to another topic. I need to deal with Transnet specific, Ms. Hogan. Just to remind ourselves, you were appointed as the Minister of Public Enterprise around May 2009. Who was your predecessor?
Minister Bridget Mabandla. She had been there for a short period of time after Minister Alec Irwin had resigned, and Minister Mabandla took over for 8 or 9 months, yeah.
And who succeeded you?
Minister Malusi Gigaba.
Okay. Now, did you have an opportunity to familiarize yourself with the issues and events which took place prior to your appointment?
Yes.
And you are introducing the topic of Transnet, in fact, with reference to page 8,
Correct.
paragraph 28. And therein you are saying that a simple but important job of appointing a CEO of Transnet after the resignation of Maria Ramos at the end of February 2009 became the site of an ugly, protracted battle between President Zuma and I, in which he thwarted all the legal and legitimate procedures that I took to obtain cabinet approval for any appointments whatsoever to Transnet, including the appointment of a CEO. As a consequence, Transnet had an acting chairperson, an acting group CEO, an acting CFO, and later on, an acting CEO in one of their divisions, Transnet Freight Rail, for 1.5 years. Now, can you please contextualize the issues which you are prefacing in that paragraph in relation to Transnet?
Okay. As I've indicated before, Transnet had gone through a restructuring process. Its balance sheet was now healthy, and it now had to embark on a major investment in equipment, in trains, and in infrastructure to really step up its performance. Maria Ramos had been CEO for 5 years, and in November 2008, she announced that she would be moving on, and the board then undertook a succession planning exercise. They consulted extensively with Minister Mabandla, and there is a document, the timeline of Transnet. We can get, I did a document that shows the extent of that.
Well, between you and Mr. Mokoena, you must feel free if you want to refer to it,
Yes.
to refer to it.
We will refer to it. Just
Later on,
give
yes.
later on,
Okay.
yes. Just give us the
I'm not going to
context.
speak to it, but I'm summarizing more here. But it was a very thorough process in which the Transnet board met with the minister. They discussed the criteria for the appointment of a new CEO, what skills, what competency, what the timeframes would be, how the interviews would be conducted, what tests would be conducted on a shortlist, who would be on the subcommittee of the board that would run that process. It was a very, very professional run process. And this is in line that the minister is empowered to appoint a CEO, but this is what you do. You allow the board, because they know what they need, to run the process, but you make sure every step of the way that you've applied your mind. So that process went ahead, and a number of people were shortlisted. Some were internal candidates, others were external. And in a letter of early February 2009, the head of the board, Mr. Fred Paswana, the chair, sends a formal letter to Minister Mabandla and says that they have decided that they're recommending one candidate only because he stood head and shoulders above the rest, and that was Minister Gordan, Pravin Gordan, okay?
Ms. Hogan, while we're still there, we will come to that. May I refer you to page 386?
Yes.
In order to help you with the timeline that you're referring to. Mine is 386. Mine is page
386.
386, yes. The first file, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you.
386. Oh, the timeline, 387. Yes, the timeline for Transnet is on page 387. Is that what?
Is the one that you were referring to the chair?
Yes, but that's a detailed, yeah. It's
Yes.
a detailed summary.
So
I'm just speaking to
Mr. Chair can
the
have reference
process.
to it, yes.
Yeah.
Now, may I refer you to Annexure A? As you were talking about Transnet on page 25, Mr. Chair. You were just about to talk about the candidate that was recommended by the board.
Yes, Annexure A1. Yes.
Yes,
So
if you may identify that document firstly for us. If you can identify the document for us, what is that document?
Yes. This is the document that I was referring to.
What is that document? What are the purpose of that document?
13th of February 2009.
And the purpose?
The purpose was to make a recommendation to the minister for the appointment of a group CEO of Transnet.
Yes. You can then proceed to take us through your evidence with reference to that document. You were saying that there was only one candidate. That's
Yes,
where
there's only one
I
candidate.
interrupted you, yes.
Now, Chair, in this proposal, and we have blacked out the assessments of other candidates because it's confidential.
Can you refer to page 27,
Yes,
paragraph 4?
yes.
Would that entail?
That's the recommendation.
Yes.
Yes. They say that, so paragraph 4 on page 27 says the Corporate Governance and Nominations Committee conducted interviews, although, and this is important because this was distorted all the time, and this paragraph is very important. Although the preference was to appoint a suitably qualified internal candidate, after consideration of the current global meltdown and the global recession, its current and future potential impact on Transnet Limited, and a thorough consideration of these individuals, the Nominations Committee, fully supported by the board, recommended the appointment of Mr. Pravin Gordan on the basis of the strengths he displayed against the competency profile and in comparison with the other candidates who were interviewed.
Yes. And you also referred to a letter that was subsequently written. May I refer you to page 31? Mr. Chair, it's Annexure A2. Are you there, Ms. Hogan?
Now, this is a letter that was sent again by Mr. Paswana to Mrs. Mabandla, which says that although the board approved Mr. Gordan, hang on, wait. And that's on page 34, that although the board had approved Mr. Gordan, he has withdrawn from the process. And we know, of course, that he became Minister of Finance shortly thereafter.
Then what happened?
Then on page 33.
Yes.
Now, on page 33, there's a very important paragraph there. In the light of your letter.
Are you now reading at the bottom of
the
page
bottom
33?
of the page.
Yes.
Bottom of page 33.
The last paragraph.
The last paragraph. In the light of your letter, it is also incumbent upon me to highlight that in the respect of Mr. Gama, the Transnet board has received documentation and reports, including, but not limited, to a recent forensic report from Transnet's internal auditors, which details serious allegations of misconduct on the part of Mr. Gama that require the company to conduct investigation to ascertain the truth thereof and decide on any appropriate action from Transnet's internal or any appropriate action against the individual involved. Do you want me to continue?
Yes.
I annex here to Annexure C, that's what I'm annexing, correspondence from Transnet internal auditors relating to the matters in question, which sets out some of the summarized information relating to the main allegations against Mr. Gama.
So at the time, the board had already considered these issues in relation to the candidacy of Mr. Gama.
Yes.
Yes. Now, what happened after Mr. Gordan has withdrawn his candidate?
I'm sorry, Mr. Mokoena. You may have said this and I missed it. Do you just want to confirm, Ms. Hogan, that at page 32, which is part of the letter from which we are reading just now, there is a list of names of the candidates who had been shortlisted, and to mention that Mr. S. Gama is one of the candidates who
Yes.
are listed there.
But you will note it's not written in numerical order.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, my question, Ms. Hogan, what happened after Mr. Gordan has withdrawn his candidature? What happened?
The board then approached, once, the board then had to find another CEO. And this is already getting towards the end of February when Ms. Ramos was due to move on. So the board then requested Minister Mabandla if they could then start a further search, because in the interviews that were done with the other candidates, both internal and external, although they did receive good reports, they just felt that those candidates did not meet the requirements for being a group CEO. Let me also say that Transnet had several divisions. All of them, I think apart one, were all run by black managers, very capable black managers, and the board was dominated by black directors. I say that because that became accusations later on.
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, you also capture the board's decision, the letter that you referred to of the chairperson at the time, Mr. Fred Paswani, if I may refer to page 34, 34?
84.
34.
34, yes.
34. The second paragraph, you're saying that the withdrawal of Mr. Pravin Gordan has resulted in the board's view in the need to commence a new appointment process, as none of the other shortlisted candidates are at the level required for such a key position for the organization and indeed for the country, given the central role that Transnet must play in the government's economic and infrastructural development plan. That's what you are testifying about. Yes.
Correct. So the board then requested the minister that they would like to embark on a further search. And they never got a definitive reply. The minister asked to receive the CVs of the other internal candidates and the assessments, plus the professional assessments, which they sent on. At one stage, she said, send me a couple of names and I will put it before a panel for them to decide. It wasn't a cabinet panel. I'm not sure what panel she was referring to. But you know, it went backwards and forwards. And when I came in as minister in May, this matter had still not been resolved. The board, however, in considering its fiduciary...
And Ms. Ramos was about to leave at that time.
Ms. Ramos had already left.
Oh, had already left.
And Minister Mabandla had approved Chris Wells as the acting CFO, as the acting CEO. He had been the chief financial officer, and had approved Anuj Singh, who had been in the Treasury, as the acting CFO prior to my appointment. So Transnet already had an acting general group CEO and an acting CFO. And one must always take into consideration that when there has to be a succession of a CEO, it's always a very vulnerable moment in any major enterprise. So the board didn't get a definitive thing, but in exercising their fiduciary responsibilities, they went ahead and did a search. And out of that, they came up with a candidate. And when I And in June, when I became a minister, and they'd done exactly the same procedures as they'd done in the previous, they then submitted that document to me recommending a candidate, a Mr. Sipho Maseko, who's now the CEO of Telkom.
May I refer you to page 35?
35, yes. Yes, that is the correspondence. Mr. Paswana met with me in person and gave me this document. What is missing from these memos are the entire assessments of all the other candidates and reasons for accepting and not accepting. So it wasn't just a blank, we want this person. The details of all the others and the strengths and weaknesses were identified.
And then may I refer you to page 38, paragraph 4?
The recommendation is then for the appointment of Mr. Sipho Maseko. And he gets a very glowing report. He'd been head of BP South Africa. He was familiar with logistics, various matters, developed very sophisticated interpersonal skills and whatever.
And may I refer to page 45, paragraph 13?
Yes.
So that is the recommendation, and you are seeing that that was the most qualified person with skills, and that was the recommendation of the board to appoint him premised on those credentials.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Now, I want to take you to the events which happens after this recommendation. On page 9, paragraph 33 of your witness statement, you refer to your meeting with the ex-president, Mr. Zuma, approximately a month after your appointment, Could you share with us what transpired in that meeting?
I felt it necessary to inform the President that Transnet did not yet have a CEO. That's a serious thing. And I gave him a full background to the whole process for the appointment of a CEO. I also said to him that the Transnet AGM was coming up and that, the shareholder would then appoint the group CEO at that meeting and a chairperson of Transnet, because Mr. Fred Paswana, by that stage, had resigned and he was leaving the company at the end of July. So both the chair had also now resigned.
Yes. What happened? What was Mr. Zuma's reaction to all the issues that we are raising in relation to Transnet?
Chair, I was extremely shocked. The President would not hear of any candidate except Siyabonga Gama. I informed him how professional the selection process was. I informed him that he was facing some serious misconduct charges, that the board, in terms of the PFMA, was obliged to investigate these charges. It wasn't just going ahead. And under these circumstances, it would not be in the interest of Transnet to appoint a group CEO who was facing, whose time would be caught up with defending himself in a misconduct. But even over and above that, I was recommending Mr. Maseko on the basis of the recommendations made by the Transnet, the recommendations made by the Professional Evaluation Agency. I won't go through them here, but they are here in this report that Mr. Paswana gave to me. It speaks very glowingly of Mr. Maseko. I will ask you to go there and do you want me to go?
Tell us what the chairperson had to say about Mr. Maseko.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you want me to do that?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. So they deal, he has a LLB in law from...
Page 38.
Sorry, it's page 38.
Let's go to page 38 and let's talk about the profile of Mr. Maseko, paragraph 4.1.
Thank you.
Yes, and it's paragraph 4.1. He has a BA and LLB, a BA at Wits, a LLB at KZN University and Durban Westville. Now, it says here, during the interview process, the panel was very impressed with the skills, experience, track record, and knowledge that Mr. Maseko had. The Transnet board are of the opinion that Mr. Maseko, who's currently the Chief Executive Officer of BP Africa, has demonstrated the ability and track record to effectively lead and manage the strategic challenges and key responsibilities related to the post of Group Chief Executive. Owing to his extensive experience, knowledge, and utility in leading and transforming a large, complex, multinational organization across Africa. He has a stable track record in BP and has successfully improved operational efficiencies, reduced costs, increased service delivery, and managed risk in a highly volatile, foreign currency-based revenue stream, and dealt with the issues and challenges presented by regulatory authorities and constraints in infrastructure development. His leadership style contributes to a transformed and streamlined organization. I will then go further and refer you to page 39.
Yes.
To effectively the second paragraph there, it starts with, he displays very sophisticated interpersonal skills and has an ability to communicate, influence, and negotiate effectively at all levels with all stakeholders. Mr. Maseko has successfully implemented world-class standards in terms of operational efficiencies, quality standards, cost structures, process, service delivery, and safety standards. His innovative flair has enabled him to effect meaningful Black economic empowerment structures and partnerships for the organization. He is well-schooled in all aspects of governance, and he has a high integrity reputation. In the past 2 years in BP Africa, he has successfully refocused the business, significantly reducing costs by 60%, moving the South African head office and remodeling the interface between the African satellite operations in South Africa. I then just go on to the independent assessment that's at the bottom of the page.
Citizens.
His suitability in terms of his leadership style, his cognitive level of functioning to handle the complexity of an organization as large as Transnet, his personality to lead with maturity, his drive and his integrity have all been independently, and I stress this, have all been independently assessed by an independent counseling psychologist who confirms he has the requisite skills, competencies, and attributes for the job. In summary, he is assessed as having a good all-round profile. I don't think I need to go further than that. Okay.
I think you do need to go further. It's quite important.
He has good thinking skills and the potential to be very effective in this executive leadership role. He is particularly good at dealing with detailed complexity, and he spends a lot of time thinking through problems in order to consider all the ramifications. He has a high level of learning potential and can be expected to engage effectively in the new learning institutions. He has sophisticated social skills and an inspirational and supportive style of leadership. He is good at motivating and encouraging people, but will confront underperformance when he needs to do so. He forms good relationships with people and has a great respect for diversity and individual differences. He likes to listen to people and guide them rather than direct them, although he can be strong and assertive when the situation requires strong leadership. He is assertive in a quiet manner and manages situations with sensitivity. He can be direct and straightforward. Do you want me to continue?
Yes.
He responds positively to change and embraces opportunities for advancement and challenge, and that's what brings enthusiasm and energy. Mr. Maseko's preferred style of problem solving is explorative and reflective when faced with an unfamiliar or new business environment or industry. This indicates that in a new large organization like Transnet, he would benefit from an experienced mentor and coach who fully understands the complexity of the organization, the industries and the challenge, and will fast-track his learning and decision-making. And then he says all the relevant checks were done.
But this is important because, you know, when we deal with other issues, I'll be posing questions to you whether the subsequent boards, when they were appointed, did one have these checks, you know, that are referred to on page 40? And what were the credentials of the different individuals that were appointed subsequent to you having left your position as the Minister of Public Enterprise? Now, can you take us all through these citizen credit criminal qualifications checks on page 40?
Okay, all relevant suitability checks were done: criminal records, citizenship verification, credit financial asset record checks, and qualification degree verification. Advocate, may I just say one thing in relation to this?
Yes.
This sounds very lyrical. Let me say that with the other candidates, a lot of very good stuff was also written and important assessments. What made me believe that this was not just trying to pull the wool over my eyes was in the assessments of the other candidates. There were frank pointers to certain issues which indicated that this would not be the perfect candidate or the most candidate. I also met with Mr. Maseko twice to get my own understanding. Sometimes you can hear good stuff. I met with him twice, and I must say he was very, very impressive and straightforward, no nonsense about him.
So he was you first, Chair.
So this was the candidate that the board was recommending after following certain processes. And it was a black candidate.
Yes.
With the academic qualifications that we have been referred to, and quite a lot of experience according to the board's letter.
Yes.
Yes.
In recommending this candidate, I also liaised with my Deputy Minister, Enoch Gordon-Gwana, who is the chair of the Economics Transformation Commission in the NEC of the ANC. He was fully behind this candidate, and he had engaged very extensively. I asked him to concentrate. I also spoke to Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe, because he was supposedly head of the deployment committee at that time, and he said he knew him and he thought he was an excellent candidate. Okay.
Thank you.
Despite all that process and the recommendation of the board, Mr. Zuma was saying that Mr. Kama should be the one that must be
Yes.
appointed. Now,
Yeah. Carry on.
you wanted to elaborate?
Go ahead, Ms. Hogan. You wanted to say something in response.
You may proceed.
Yes, it actually shocked me. He then said to me, you may not appoint anyone to the board, because the board also had to have changes, until Mr. Gama's disciplinary was over. Because I said to him, we cannot appoint him until that disciplinary is over, if that's the candidate you're insisting on. He said, until that disciplinary is over, you will appoint no one.
Now, when the former president said to you that he wanted Mr. Kama to be appointed as the CEO, had you furnished him with documentation such as this recommendation, for example,
Yes.
from the board, so that he could familiarize himself with how the board had come to the decision to recommend this one as opposed to any other candidate?
I did, and later on, as the advocate will lead me, I gave him a more comprehensive document, which included the Trendgrove and Katz opinions, and an extensive document that outlined all of this. Yes, I did.
Do you know whether, when he informed you for the first time that Mr. Kama was the one who should be appointed, he had read or had had an opportunity to read the documentation you had given him?
I could never give documentation ahead of a meeting. That was part of the problems with the way that office operated. And in those early months, it was pretty disorganized. And remember, this is a month into my job. Yeah, it was still disorganized. The president's office, a lot of the staff had been redeployed into the deputy president's office, who'd been staff members. So, you know, sending stuff in, it was confusing. So I took documents with me to the president, but I briefed him according to the documents.
Yes. Okay, what I wanted to find out was whether at the time he expressed the view, he had already had the benefit of
No.
reading them. He had not.
No.
But he had the benefit of you briefing him in that meeting.
Yes.
And did he express this view that Mr. Gama should be the one to be appointed at that same meeting where you briefed him, or subsequently?
No, at that same meeting. You know, initially he wanted me to go ahead with the appointment of Mr. Gama. I said, I can't do that. The kind of compromise he then said, he said, all right, we will wait until the disciplinary process is over. I didn't agree to that, but we then agreed that I would provide him with further information, which I then did.
Yes, thank you.
Did the president, the ex-president, provide you or the board with any reason why Mr. Maseko was not supposed to be appointed when he insisted that Mr. Gama and Mr. Gama alone should be the one that is appointed?
He never raised objections about Mr. Maseko. He never referred to Mr. Maseko. It was just, this is my candidate. And Mr. Maseko was, you know, he never raised objections or reasons why he should not be appointed.
When he came up with Mr. Gama's name, as far as you know, was that
Page.
because in briefing him, you had told him what the names of the other candidates who had been shortlisted were? Or do you know whether he might have had the name even before your meeting with him?
I had the impression that he had the name before I met with him. He seemed to, you know, there were a lot of allegations going around, and he seemed to be familiar with those allegations. They were wrongful allegations, but he was aware of them.
So whatever may have influenced him to make the choice that he made may have been what you said, maybe plus whatever else he might have known before the meeting.
And also, I'm not sure, because I have no evidence thereof, but it came out in a month or two later that the ANC and a whole number of organizations were supporting Gama completely as the candidate. And it might have been that these matters might have been discussed with him in his capacity as head of the ANC. And of course, there were all sorts of allegations being made that Mr. Gama was being sidelined because Mr. Wells, a white man who was the acting CEO, had also applied for the job, and it was a plot to marginalize a very competent black manager. Mr. Wells had applied for the job in December 2008, but he withdrew his application 3 days later. So there was a lot of false allegations going around.
But at the time that Mr. Maseko was recommended, Mr. Wells had withdrawn his application already. He was no longer a candidate, or?
He was no longer a candidate.
Yes.
Not at all.
So, for all intents and purposes, to the extent that the former president or any one of the organizations you refer to may have wanted Mr. Gama, as far as the board was concerned and as far as you were concerned as Minister of Public Enterprises, they were wanting Mr. Gama over Mr. Maseko.
Correct.
And not over Mr. Wells.
No, over Mr. Maseko.
And,
But they were saying that Mr. Wells, and this will come out later, had conspired to marginalize Mr. Gama by instituting, and the board had instructed him to institute, by instituting an investigation into those misconduct charges.
But they never said anything as to why Mr. Maseko was not good enough.
No, it was just Gama, and that's it.
Yes. Thank you. Mr. Mkwena.
You, in your attempt or your attempts to persuade the ex-president, Mr. Zuma, about the suitable candidate that must be appointed in having regard to the process that was undertaken, the board's resolution, you also dispatched a comprehensive memorandum that you're talking about. If you can go to page 53.
Yeah, got it.
Are you there?
Yes.
Is that the memorandum that you said that you dispatched to the ex-president, Mr. Zuma, and you also annexed to that memorandum the relevant opinions which you have received?
Correct.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mkwena. The meeting that you had with the former president, where you briefed him, how did it end? So what was the basis on which you parted on that occasion?
He was insisting, first he insisted that I go ahead and appoint Gama. I said I couldn't. He was facing misconduct charges, and he was not the preferred candidate. He then said that no appointment to Transnet must be made until the disciplinary case against Mr. Gama is concluded. I was concerned about that, and I said I would provide him with further evidence. I was already, remember, I was only 1 month into that job, but I was already feeling that the president was exceeding his authority here. And I was truly shocked. When you explain to the president that a person is facing misconduct charges, you expect a certain response that says, oh, well, if that is the case, let us look at the preferred candidate that the board is recommending. Do you know what I mean? You're not going to encumber Transnet, that is so important, with a candidate who's going to be involved in controversy. And the fact that the president was absolutely insistent, Gama, you will be appointed.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I see it's 1 o'clock. Is this an appropriate time to adjourn?
Yes. Thank you very much. We are going to take the lunch adjournment, and we will resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
We adjourn.
All right.
Yes, kids, eh?
Sure. It's up to you.
Ah, ke a tla mo tsona.